London, 1888. At the height of the British Empire, London was the most powerful city on earth. It controlled trade routes, colonies, and wealth across continents. From the outside, it was a symbol of progress and civilization. But beneath that polished surface, another London existed, darker, poorer, and largely ignored. The East End of London was a world apart. Here, overcrowded slums stretched for miles. Families lived packed into single rooms. Disease spread easily. Jobs were unstable. Hunger was constant. Alcohol was often the only escape. Every night, thousands slept in lodging houses, so cheap that a single missed payment meant sleeping on the street. For many women, survival came at a terrible cost. Prostitution was not a profession, it was a last resort. A few pennies earned at night could buy a bed, a meal, or a chance to survive another day. Death was common in Whitechapel, so common that when a woman was found dead, it rarely caused panic. Until August 31st, 1888. In the early hours of the morning, a body was discovered, lying on a quiet street called Bucks Row. The woman was identified as Mary Ann Nichols. Her throat had been cut deeply. Her skirt was lifted. Her abdomen showed signs of violence. At first, police believed it was another tragic but familiar crime, perhaps a drunken fight or a robbery gone wrong. But when the doctor examined her body more closely, something disturbing became clear. The wounds were not random. They were deliberate, controlled, purposeful. This was not an impulsive act. Someone had done this calmly, efficiently, and without panic. Still, the police did not yet realize what they were dealing with. 1 week later, on September 8, 1888, the truth could no longer be ignored. Another body was found, this time behind a house on Hanbury Street. The victim was Annie Chapman. Like Nichols, her throat had been slashed. But this time, the violence went further. Her abdomen had been opened. Parts of her body were missing. The killer had escalated. Now fear began to spread. Newspapers rushed to print horrifying details. Headlines spoke of a mysterious murderer haunting the East End. Rumors filled the streets. Some said the killer was a foreigner. Others believed he was a doctor. Some whispered that he was not human at all. The police were under immense pressure, but they were unprepared. Victorian policing had no forensic science. There was no DNA testing, no fingerprints, no blood analysis. Investigations relied on eyewitnesses, frightened people describing shadowy figures seen in poor lighting, often contradicting one another. And then something happened that transformed the case forever. Letters began arriving at newspaper offices and police stations, written in red ink, mocking the authorities, describing the murders with chilling confidence. One of them ended with a signature that would echo through history. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Whether the killer wrote the letter or not remains debated. But the damage was done. The name caught fire. Newspapers repeated it endlessly. The public embraced it with morbid fascination. The murderer was no longer just a criminal. He was a legend. On September 30th, 2 more women were attacked within a single night. Elizabeth Stride was found with her throat cut, but her body was not mutilated. Many investigators believe the killer was interrupted before he could continue. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was found dead in another part of the city. This time, the violence was extreme. Her face was slashed. Her abdomen was opened. One of her kidneys was removed. The message was clear. The killer was growing more confident. London was now in full panic. Citizens formed night patrols. Shopkeepers closed early. Women refused to walk alone. Mothers kept their children indoors. Every dark alley felt dangerous. And yet, Jack the Ripper continued to vanish into the fog without leaving a trace. The police questioned hundreds of suspects. Sailors, butchers, immigrants, doctors, even innocent men were beaten by mobs fueled by fear and suspicion. But nothing worked. Then came November 9th, 1888. Mary Jane Kelly was found murdered in her rented room on Miller's Court. Unlike the previous victims, she was killed indoors. What police found inside shocked even hardened officers. Her body was almost unrecognizable. This was the most brutal murder of all. And then, the killing stopped. No arrest was made. No confession ever confirmed. Jack the Ripper disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived. London slowly returned to normal. But the mystery never left. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, something strange happened. The streets of Whitechapel slowly grew quieter. Nights passed without another body. Days turned into weeks. The killer who had terrorized London seemed to have vanished into thin air. But instead of relief, a deeper unease settled over the city. Because Jack the Ripper had never been caught, the police were left with unanswered questions and public humiliation. Newspapers openly mocked their failures. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police blamed each other. Investigators were overwhelmed, exhausted, and outmatched by a killer who appeared to understand the city better than they did. And so began the most controversial part of the Ripper story, the suspects. Over the years, dozens of names would be dragged into the spotlight. Some were genuinely suspicious. Others were victims of fear, prejudice, or rumor. But none could ever be proven beyond doubt. One of the earliest theories was that Jack the Ripper had medical knowledge. The precision of the cuts, the removal of organs, and the speed of the attacks suggested someone familiar with anatomy. This led police to question surgeons, doctors, medical students, and slaughterhouse workers. But Victorian medicine was far from modern. Many trades involved cutting meat or animals. Precision alone was not proof. Another popular theory focused on foreigners, especially Jewish immigrants who had recently arrived in large numbers in the East End. Anti-immigrant sentiment was already high, and fear turned easily into blame. Innocent people were attacked in the streets, based on nothing more than accents or appearance. The police found no evidence. Then there were the letters. Hundreds of letters claimed to be written by Jack the Ripper. Most were hoaxes. Some were cruel jokes. Others were desperate attempts for attention. But one letter, known as the From Hell letter, stood out. It arrived with half of a human kidney enclosed. The letter was poorly spelled, short, and disturbing. The kidney appeared to match the one removed from Catherine Eddowes. If genuine, it meant the killer was taunting authorities directly. But even this could not be proven conclusively. As the investigation dragged on, internal police documents reveal something troubling. Many officers believed the killer was already dead, imprisoned for another crime, or had left the country. In other words, Jack the Ripper may have stopped not because he was caught, but because circumstances changed. This idea only deepened the mystery. As years passed, the Ripper case refused to fade. Instead, it grew larger. Writers, historians, and amateur detectives reopened the files. New suspects emerged decades after the murders ended. One of the most infamous suspects was a man named Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and schoolteacher with a troubled personal life. Shortly after the final murder, Druitt died by suicide. Some officials privately believed he may have been the killer, but there was no solid evidence, no eyewitness testimony, and no forensic proof. Another suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who suffered from severe mental illness. He lived in the East End and was eventually institutionalized. Some modern researchers believe he is the strongest suspect, based on later police notes. But again, there was no arrest, no trial, and no confession. Then there was the royal conspiracy theory. According to this idea, the murders were connected to members of the British royal family and were covered up to protect the monarchy. While dramatic and popular in books and films, historians largely reject this theory due to lack of evidence. But perhaps the most unsettling truth is this. Jack the Ripper was not unique. Whitechapel was a place where violence against poor women was common and rarely investigated thoroughly. Many murders went unsolved. Many victims were forgotten. Jack the Ripper became famous not only because of his crimes, but because newspapers turned him into a story. He was one of the first modern serial killers created partly by media attention. The name Jack the Ripper gave the killer power. It turned fear into fascination. It allowed the murderer to become something more than human, a symbol, a myth. And that myth refused to die. In the decades that followed, Jack the Ripper became a cultural obsession. Books were written, films were made, tours were organized. The streets where real women had suffered became tourist attractions. But in all this fascination, something was often lost. The victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. They were not characters in a mystery. They were real people living in extreme poverty, trapped in a system that gave them few choices and little protection. Their deaths exposed the dark underside of Victorian society, the inequality, the neglect, and the willingness to look away until horror forced attention. Jack the Ripper was never caught, but his story revealed something deeper and more disturbing than the identity of a single killer. It revealed a city that allowed suffering to become invisible. And that may be the most uncomfortable truth of all. By the early 20th century, London had changed. Gas lamps gave way to electric lights. Slums were cleared. Policing methods slowly improved. But Jack the Ripper remained frozen in time, an unanswered question buried in Victorian fog. As forensic science advanced, many believed the mystery would finally be solved. Fingerprints, criminal profiling, DNA. Surely, modern science could succeed where 19th century police had failed. But the Ripper case refused to cooperate. Most physical evidence was either lost, contaminated, or never preserved properly. Crime scenes had been washed down, clothing handled by countless people, organs buried or destroyed. What little survived had passed through too many hands. Even so, modern investigations tried. In the late 20th and early 21st century, criminal profilers analyzed the murders using behavioral science. They concluded that Jack the Ripper was likely a local man, familiar with Whitechapel streets, comfortable moving at night, and psychologically driven by control rather than sexual gratification alone. This suggested he was not a wealthy outsider or aristocrat, but someone ordinary, someone who blended in. Then came DNA claims. In 2014, researchers announced they had tested DNA from a shawl allegedly belonging to Catherine Eddowes. The results were said to match descendants of Aaron Kosminski. Headlines declared the case solved. But historians and geneticists quickly raised serious doubts. The shawl's authenticity was questionable. DNA testing methods were controversial. Contamination was almost guaranteed. No peer-reviewed confirmation followed. Once again, certainty slipped away. And so Jack the Ripper returned to what he had always been, a shadow. What makes this case so powerful is not just the violence, but the timing. Jack the Ripper emerged at the birth of modern media. Newspapers competed fiercely for attention. Sensational headlines sold copies. Fear became profitable. The killer understood this, whether consciously or instinctively. For the first time in history, a murderer became famous while still active. The public followed every detail. Rumors spread faster than facts. The line between truth and fiction blurred. And that pattern has repeated itself ever since in countless true crime cases around the world. In many ways, Jack the Ripper created the blueprint for modern serial killer mythology. But the real lesson of the Ripper case is not about the killer. It is about society. Whitechapel was ignored until bodies appeared. Poverty was tolerated until it became inconvenient. Women were dismissed as unimportant until their deaths could no longer be hidden. Jack the Ripper did not exist in isolation. He thrived in darkness created by neglect. And when the murders stopped, the system did not change overnight. The killer vanished, but the conditions that allowed him to exist remained for decades. That is why the mystery still matters. Not because we crave horror, but because unresolved injustice leaves echoes. More than a century later, people still walk the streets of Whitechapel asking the same question. Who was Jack the Ripper? But perhaps the better question is this. How did a city allow him to exist at all? Because the greatest mystery of Jack the Ripper is not his name. It is how easily he disappeared.